So I hope that everyone... Welcome to all to the event Water Flow Regulations in a Fragmented World. Today, in this hour and a half, we will present the initiative launched by Iucn and the Geneva Water Hub. We all know that dams alter the natural flow of the river, and if poorly planned, they block fish and sediment passage, among other social impacts. It is therefore highly important that the legal rules of dam filling and management are homogenized and follow certain principles, especially in dams situated in different regions, and of course, even more important, the ones that are situated in transboundary settings. We will hear about ongoing projects and these topics and others shortly. But before, some housekeeping. Please remember to keep your microphones muted, and if you have questions, write them in the chat box. We will collect them and address them to the speakers during the Q&A segment. Now, I would like to give the floor to Christian Breton, Scientific Director of the Geneva Water Hub, and then to Alejandro Isa, Director of the Iucn Environmental Law Center, for the introductory remarks. The floor is yours, Christian.
Well, thanks a lot, Maria. Welcome, everyone. We are very much pleased to see you all attending this side event of the 9th session of the meeting of the parties to the Water Convention. As already mentioned by Maria, this side event is entitled Water Flows Regulation in a Fragmented World, which is actually the name of an initiative jointly and proudly developed by the Iucn Environmental Law Center and the Geneva Water Hub. And I will put in the chat box afterwards the link. So if you want to have a look, just take this opportunity. The very start of this initiative takes place actually in 2019, when the Geneva Water Hub hosted a roundtable on the question of the role of large dam in transboundary water negotiations. And at that time, the objective of such meeting was to discuss the blooming era of large dams constructions worldwide, to explore existing challenges, and to analyze the multiple practices implemented in such situation. And during that meeting in particular, we had the pleasure to host one specific session on legal tools and instruments for dam construction and management. And Alejandro Isa introduced at that moment the fragmentation and diversity of existing frameworks when talking about construction and management of dams. So such session was actually the starting point of this initiative, in which we aim to explore actually the topic of dams by looking at existing benefits, focusing on existing negative externalities, at existing impacts at multiple scales, and obviously also at legal and governance challenges. So in this morning's session, our aim is to showcase actually the first output related to this initiative. And we will present a compendium of legal tools applicable to dams planning, development, and monitoring that we published a few weeks ago. And our objective with this publication is really to trigger a reflection and to analyze the multiple sources of law to be considered and to be potentially mobilized by the different actors involved in such processes. We are very much excited to share the work and also to exchange with well-known experts. And we also hope that our initiative with this initiative in this today's session will open up new pathways for collaboration, because indeed we really see the current draft of our compendium as a living document that certainly needs to be further refined and developed. And moreover, in the same collaborative spirit, we see this initiative like overall as an open and welcome any inputs and willingness to contribute to the work. As a side event of the meeting of the parties, talking about the question of dams planning, development, and monitoring is quite evident and relevant. And such question relates notably to several key moments of the agenda, be it the high-level segment on water in peace, the challenges related to water allocation in transboundary setting, or to more specific approaches such as the water, food, energy ecosystem nexus approach that has been developed by UNEC for a few years now. By presenting and discussing our ongoing work, we hope to get insightful viewpoint on such hot topic for many parts of the world. And really, I look forward to upcoming exchanges. And would like now to invite my colleague and friend Alejandro Isa to say a few words as well about this joint initiative. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian, for this summary, this detailed summary about our initiative. And I'm very proud to be here. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. Tomby said that the history of civilizations was driven by a dynamic process to address environmental challenges. And nobody will contest nowadays that water has been a key part of that process. The ever first recorded dam was built around 2,900 years before Christ in Memphis in Egypt. The Sumerians and the Assyrians in Mesopotamia were experts in dam building. They used them to supply water for the cities and for irrigation. But since then, a lot of water has gone through the rivers of history, and building dams has grown exponentially. The world has assisted to a pro-dam movement, but also to an anti-dam movement. And with an increasing number of large dams for hydropower generation being built and also for water storage, in sensitive areas, particularly like international rivers, there is, I think, a need to monitor and improve the strategies, the standards, the policies, and assess the procedures relating to dams, as it has been requested in 2012 by Resolution 89 adopted by the World Conservation Congress in South Korea in Jeju. Dams, you know, are controversial for various reasons. They require choices, compromises, social and political negotiations, as well as balancing economic and environmental interests. End of 1990s, our organization, Iucn, was instrumental in setting up the World Commission on Dams. Since the release of the Commission's report, a number of projects have been completed, initiated, terminated, and the discussions around dams continue and get quite controversial. 2,900 years before Christ, the crimes regulated by the Code of Hammurabi included the failure to care or maintain dams. Later on, the Romans, under Antonius Pius, established the principle of flumen publicum, flowing rivers belong to the public, and codified riparians and landowners' rights. Nowadays, the complexities of the legal dimension is much broader, much bigger than in those days. They are massive, I will say. It is difficult to disentangle them. Classic features of these dimensions are permits, social and environmental and risk assessments, access to information and disclosure, transparency and participation of stakeholder, remedies, interstate cooperation, rules and principles, and transnational conflicts. But in my view, this dimension extends into other matters not necessarily directly seen as legal. I'm talking about the status of utility companies, energy generation, access and distribution, funding and investment plans, compliance with technical, economical, social, and environmental criteria, the circuit of payments, energy prices, subsidies, the enforcement of legislation and regulation, and dismantling infrastructure, not to forget. And beyond environmental impacts, what about social ones? What about the displacement of people and communities, the impact on women, indigenous peoples? It is precisely because of all this that we are working together with the Geneva Water Hub in this initiative, is to analyze the responses and to elaborate the solutions to some of the challenges I just mentioned. At this point in time, allow me to pay tribute to our colleague, Francois Munger. His vision and his leadership was instrumental in the birth of this initiative. The adequate governance of water infrastructure has been crucial for decades for many organizations, including Iucn. Precisely a few days ago in Marseille, at the World Conservation Congress, the members of our organization adopted Resolution 52, requesting states whose territories are located within the Paraguay-Paraná wetland system to carry out detailed studies on the impacts deriving from building major projects in the Alto Paraguay basin, but also to regularly monitor the possible impacts of dams in operation, and also call upon them to use water in an equitable and reasonable manner and avoiding harm to other states. So this shows again that the issue comes on and on again and again. Martin Luther said that law and order exists for the purpose of establishing justice. But when they fail, they become dams, he said, to block the flow of social progress. Law cannot fail in this respect. It should not be a dam to social progress, but a tool for dams to be vehicles for socioeconomic and environmental progress, for peace and prosperity. Thank you, dear colleagues. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention. Thank you, Geneva Water Hub, for this excellent partnership. I'm very proud of this, as I said. And now I would like to pass the floor to Diego. Thank you.
Hi, thanks a lot for all these nice introductions, and a lot of topics were already mentioned. Now it's time to hear about the first output of this project, and I would like to invite Mrs. Mara Tignino, Lead Legal Specialist at the Geneva Water Hub, and Mr. Diego Jara, Legal Officer in the Environmental Law Center of Iucn, for the presentation of the review of legal tools that apply to planning, development, operation, and monitoring of dams.
Hello, many thanks, Maria, for the introduction. So as Maria said, we would like to introduce the first output of this initiative developed by the Iucn and the Geneva Water Hub. And this first output has focused on the legal tools applicable to the planning, development, and monitoring of dams. We see this first output as still a work in progress. So now also we will benefit from the inputs of the experts that we will hear afterwards, and also, of course, we also look forward to the questions that we will receive. So as it was mentioned, of course, international law cannot cannot provide all the solutions, but we think that is an extremely important tool for the prevention of water conflicts that many times can be related to the dams. So in this first output, we focused on these three key moments: the planning, the development, and the monitoring. So the planning, really not the moment of the plans of the dam, when we still have a project, the development, so the construction phase, and the monitoring, so when dams are there, so what are the mechanisms to monitor the impact of this water infrastructure. So with my colleague and friend Diego, we are going to present these different steps of the initiative. So what is the methodology of this first output? We will give you an overview about the Geneva Convention, so the convention relating to the development of hydraulic power affecting more than one state. So we will call it Geneva Convention. And then we have the two UN Global Water Conventions, so the UN Water Courses Convention, the UNEC Water Convention. Then we will go also through the customary principles of international environmental law and multilateral environmental agreements, and also so the role of human rights instruments and international standards. And then we will give some of the findings of this first output. So what we did in the publication that you can find in the website that we shared, we really looked at the different frameworks and rules that are applicable at these different steps of the operationalization of water in the infrastructure. And in particular, no, we focused on 6 category of tools. So the 23 Geneva Convention, so this is really the only existing convention that is completely focused on the development of hydraulic power on international rivers. And so no, how no, we will see what are the different principles that are contained in this convention. Then the second tool, it is related so to the Global Water Convention and also the customary principles of international water law that are included in these global instruments. And then we applied the same methodology also to the analysis of the multilateral environmental agreements and the customary principles that also are contained in these agreements. And then we also included the analysis of the instruments of human rights and international standards, so environmental and social standards applicable to the construction of dams. I would like to stress that in this first output, we focused on global instruments. So the regional or basin agreements, you will not find in this first output. We really wanted to include in this first output the global framework applicable to this water infrastructure, in particular focusing on large dams. So the Geneva Convention, so the only global convention existing on this specific topic, it is only ratified by 16 states, and I think it is interesting when you go through this convention that it contains quite progressive principles. So we can find the duty of not causing damage to another riparians that we know that is one of the pillar of in international water law, the obligation not to cause a significant harm. So if on one side the right to use water and to exploit the hydraulic power of international rivers, but at the same time taking into account the duty of not causing significant harm. And the other 2 elements of this convention that are quite progressive and innovative, especially if we think that it was negotiated in the 20s, it is a duty to enter into negotiation in case of the disagreement between the country, and also it is the convention provide the right to resort to an international investigation mechanism to find a common solution between the 2 countries that are in dispute. So this is something innovative and progressive, to include this obligatory mechanism to solve a dispute related to the construction of dam. Then regarding the UN Watercourses Convention, the Water Convention, we will have a specific presentation on this from Alistair, but just to say a few words about this. Of course, these 2 global conventions contains customary principles of international water law, like the equitable reasonable use, the no harm principle, the prior notification, that are all elements that should be taken into account in the development, in the planning of dams. And of course, each of these convention specifies some aspect. For example, as also will mention Alice, the UN Water Courses Convention contain a precise procedure related to the notification of planned measure. And we have also in these two conventions general and specific provisions that directly or indirectly relate to the planning, development, monitoring of dams, like, for example, the exchange of technical information, the flow regulation, the maintenance of installation. So all these provisions, norms, are related to the development of dams. And then, of course, at the basis of these two conventions, we have the duty of cooperation between riparian countries, and depending on the convention, we have a recommendation or a requirement to establish a joint mechanism or commissions that can play a significant role also in the planning of dams, and also in preventing disputes related to the development of dams. So now I pass the floor to Diego for the presentation to continue.
Many thanks, dear Mara. It's a pleasure to see you and see all the colleagues that have joined in the presentation of this initiative on dams. My name is Diego Jara, Legal Officer of the Iucn Environmental Law Center, and I will just give a short overview of first the customary principles that we found in this legal review. Some of the principles that we found were mainly the sovereign right of states, of course, to exploit their own resource according to their own policies and laws, these environmental policies, environmental laws, and of course, all of these within the limits of international law. Another key principle is the duty not to cause damage to the environment of other states or areas beyond the national jurisdiction. This, of course, includes all appropriate measures to prevent significant transboundary harm. And this is a principle that you will see in the UN Water Courses Convention and also in the UNEC Water Convention. A key principle as well, the principle of sustainable development, meaning that all the projects on hydropower development must take into account aspects of environment, social aspects, as well as economic ones, to meet not only the current needs of the generations at the moment, but also of future generations. And one key principle that we have identified is of cooperation. And this cooperation, meaning to cooperation to manage jointly, to protect and restore the integrity of freshwater ecosystems. Other principles that we identified were the precautionary approach, the duty to ensure prior notification, the obligation to carry out environmental impact assessments, and in general, due diligence. And why is this important? If we can go to the next slide, please. When we see these principles already applied in practice, I just wanted to give a short example. In my home country, we have the dam Coca-Cola Sinclair. It was projected to be the largest hydropower project in Ecuador. It became operational in 2016, thinking of a capacity of 1,500 megawatts. But already 2 years after its starting of operation, nearly 8,000 cracks were identified. And this has, of course, caused regressive erosion in the Rio River Coca, and already 2 spills in this river, which is a tributary of the Amazon River. So here we see the connection between the principles that we just saw, preventing damage to other states, the duty to take all necessary mechanisms to prevent harm, and also of due diligence. If we can go to the next slide. In the legal review, we also identified key multilateral environmental agreements. As Mara said, these were firstly considered at the global level. Among these agreements, we have the 1971 Ramsar Convention, the World Heritage Convention, the Convention of Migratory Species, the Convention of the Law of the Sea, ESPO Convention, and the Convention on Biological Diversity, as well as the Convention on Climate Change. And the importance of these instruments, I will just mention a few of them, is that in the case, let's say, of the Ramsar Conventions, we know that there is a potential for dams to cause impact on wetlands and mainly on their main ecological functions as regulators of the water regimes and as well as home to flora and fauna. The case of the World Heritage Convention as well, many projects in the globe are potentially affecting natural and cultural heritage. And the convention, the World Heritage Convention, has an interesting tool in its Article 6, which says that the convention establishes that each state party will not take any deliberated measure which might damage directly or indirectly the cultural and natural heritage. As you see, we have these instruments, and within each one of these instruments, we have specific provisions that can help in order to prevent the impacts of potential impacts of dams at the planning stage. Also, in the case of the World Heritage Convention, we have the World Heritage Committee that has already called on parties to pay attention to the impacts of dams on natural and cultural sites. In the case of the Convention on Migratory Species, the CBD, UNCLOS, it is clear the relation that, or the impact that the construction of dams would have on biodiversity, specifically on migratory species, salmon, for instance. If we see in Europe, if we see different species around the globe that will find these obstacles to their normal life cycle. So this needs to be considered when planning, when developing, when monitoring dams, that there is it's required to establish specific biodiversity and conservation policies, mechanisms in order to protect freshwater biodiversity. We also have an interesting convention, which is the ESPO Convention. And well, if you would like we would like to mention afterwards the relationship of these conventions with human rights as well. But just at the moment, the ESPO Convention is important because it specifically includes large dams and the reservoirs that they require specific environmental impact assessment before deciding its authorization or planning. So it's an important tool in order to prevent the impacts of dams. If we pass to the next slide, just as a matter of illustration, as I was mentioning, the World Heritage Committee emphasized on the potential damages of hydropower dams. Here it's just a mention of the planned dams in Tanzania that had the potential to affect the Selous Game Reserve. If we go to the next slide, please. Also, in the legal review, we identified specific human rights instruments. And this is important to mention because we didn't just want to see the environment side of the impacts of dams, but also the social impacts, the potential social impacts on the livelihoods of local communities, civil society, and particularly on indigenous peoples. And here we identified 3 global instruments and 4 regional ones. The main ones are the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and one which is crucial, we consider, is the ILO Convention and 169 on Indigenous and Tribal People Convention, as well as the Aarhus Convention, and something which is not included here yet in the document is the Escazú Agreement, which is also of great importance for the inclusion, for participation, access to justice, access to information of local communities, civil society, and indigenous peoples. If we go to the next slide, as you already could see, this is something that happened during the Congress in Marseille, as Alejandro was mentioning. There were different resolutions that were promoting the role of indigenous groups, local communities, and one of these was Resolution 5052 regarding dams in the Alto Paraguay River Basin. And here in this resolution, there was specifically a mention on the importance of preventing transboundary harm and promoting participation of indigenous groups in decision-making, in planning, and of course, taking into account the respect of their territories, the respect of their ancient knowledge. So all of these are efforts towards continuing to take into account social aspects in dams planning, operations, and monitoring. With this, I would like to give back the floor to my colleague Mara, who is going to continue with the international standards identified and give some conclusion remarks from this first of the legal review. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Diego. So just to continue with the last tool that we have identified to the planning, development, and monitoring of dams. So we identified some international standards that concern the environmental and social risks related to the construction of dams. In particular, so we identified the hydropower sustainability assessment protocol, the performance standards of the International Finance Corporation, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and the OECD guidelines on multinational corporations. And some of these standards will be discussed by our speaker, Angelica. So here now what it is different from the other instruments that we have discussed. It is not the focus on the responsibilities of private actors and the non-binding nature of these instruments. However, no, we think that these instruments play an increasing important role, and Angelica will offer some insights in this regard. Also, it seems to us important, for example, to raise the issue of the current negotiation of a binding instruments on business and human rights. So to conclude from this first output, our findings show that there is no a single global instrument concerning the regulation of dams, particularly large dams. The instruments applicable to the construction, development, and monitoring of dams are contained in different areas of international law, including international water law, environmental law, and human rights law. So this also raised the challenge of the need of an harmonization between this area of international law. For something that we have not included in this first output, it is international investment law that is also relevant to this issue. And the third finding, it is related to the responsibilities of multinational and business enterprise involved in the construction of dams. And as I mentioned before, so there is currently the negotiation of a binding instrument on business and human rights. And so we, one of also final finding of this first output, it was the importance, of course. We have drawn these global frameworks that are applicable to large dams, but it is also important the adoption of specific rules and principles at the domestic level, at the regional and basin level. So these also need to be read in a complementary way to the global frameworks. So many thanks for your attention. Thank you.
Thanks, Mara and Diego, for presenting us the first result of this study. Let's move on to the panel discussion with 3 experts that will present their views on tools and frameworks at the global level. With further review, I would like to invite now Mr. Alistair to the floor. Alistair Rieu-Clark is professor at Northumbria University. His research focuses on the interface between international law, sustainable development, and transboundary waters. And he has participated in several projects around the world. Since September 2017, Alistair has been working as a legal advisor to the United Nations Economic Commissions for Europe, agency responsible for the implementation of the SDGs. Alistair, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Maria. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me, and greetings to dear participants. My voice is failing me a little bit this morning, so I hope you'll be able to hear me. So I think Mara and Diego has set the scene really nicely there. So I'll focus in on the 2 global conventions, the 1997 Watercourses Convention and 1992 Water Convention. Do they cover dams? Well, you might at first think, oh, it's surprising that they don't specifically mention dams. The closest you get is words like installations or regulation works. But I think dams are very much at the heart of both instruments, the provisions that are included therein. You can look at in terms of scope. So in terms of what both instruments cover, they take a very broad approach. So they cover, if you look at the 97 Watercourses Convention, it applies to the uses of international watercourses in their waters, and measures of protection, preservation, and management. So clearly very broad and clearly covering dams. Similarly, the 92 Convention is on the protection and use of transboundary waters. So encompassing all uses, and certainly covering dams. What do the conventions say you can do or can't do around those uses? And essentially both conventions, as and already mentioned by Mara and Diego, basically encompass 3 broad norms, substantive norms around the duty to take all appropriate measures to prevent significant harm or transboundary impact, the principle of equitable and reasonable utilization, and obligation to protect ecosystems of an international watercourse or transboundary waters. These are 3 norms at the core of both conventions and very relevant to dams. If we look at the definition of transboundary impact, it's any significant adverse effect on the environment resulting from a change in the conditions of transboundary waters caused by a human activity, the physical origin of which is situated wholly or in part within an area under the jurisdiction of a party, within an area under the jurisdiction of another party. So transboundary impacts, wide-ranging, definitely encompassing dams. The principle of equitable and reasonable use at the core of both conventions, I think relates to, you could say relates to dams in 2 very broad ways. One is you could see as a kind of in a positive way in terms of encompassing that right to maximize the benefits of an international watercourse to equitably share the benefits of a watercourse, and an example there would be in the Columbia River, US, Canada, a nice example of equitable benefit sharing, but also an obligation to ensure that any uses do not lead to an inequitable result. And we can see in the famous Gabčíkova-Nážmarš case, where the International Court noted that a diversion of a mainstream of a Danube by 90% is clearly inequitable. Thirdly, around protection of ecosystems, we see stronger and stronger recognition of the need to protect ecosystems as we understand better the interaction between dams and ecosystems. And I think we can see more and more specific provisions around dams and ecosystems. And that was reflected in the Kishinganga arbitration, where there was a specific mention of a need to, when India developing a project upstream, needed to account for environmental flows down to from the dam down to Pakistan. So that's broadly, we say the substantive norms very much encompass dams, but I think what equally important are the procedural requirements. How do you put that into practice? And there we see in both conventions, and again, Mara and Diego have nicely picked up on the key ones here, but both conventions include procedural aspects around data information exchange, notification and consultation, transboundary environmental impact assessment. I think with the 97, there's a little bit of difference in the conventions, and I think this is where they can feed off each other and complement each other. In environmental impact assessment, for example, at 92 Water Convention emphasizes the need to include EIA process as part of the tasks of any joint body established. The 97 Convention provides quite detailed procedures around notification consultation and says when you notify, if you've conducted an EIA, please share that at the time of notification. I'm just, in the interest of time, I'll just highlight another few areas around included in conventions. The 97 Convention talks about the protection of installations in times of armed conflict, the maintenance of installations, regulation of flow, other provisions, joint monitoring and assessment, joint research and development contained in the 92 Water Convention. Both conventions talk about early warning and alarm systems, mutual assistance, and dispute settlement, all very pertinent to provisions around activities around dams. I was asked to say, well, now we've got all this great global provisions within these two framework conventions. Is it enough? Is it sufficient? And how might these norms be complemented at a basin level? I would say it's not enough. It's a good basis, but there is this need to tailor those provisions to a basin-specific context. First and foremost, then there needs to be basin arrangements in place. Both conventions encourage the negotiation adoption of arrangements at a basin-specific level. It's a requirement within the 92 Water Convention amongst parties, also reflected in the SDGs and the indicator 652 on operational arrangements. And I think that's where those arrangements can add a lot of detail in terms of how you really go about this notification and consultation, how you go about the EIAs, what mandate you give to joint bodies to conduct such procedural arrangements, the roles of the secretariat, technical bodies, and so forth. I think that can only come in at a basin-specific level. And I would just say in closing as well, not just the basin level, but again, as Diego and Mara have mentioned, there's this suite of instruments, human rights, policies and guidelines of the development banks, industry standards, OECD guidelines. And I think there's a real opportunity there to look more in depth, because that all adds flavor and texture as well to these broader rules and principles that you find in the global framework conventions. So I'll leave it to there, and I hope that was a decent overview.
Thanks a lot for your experiences and your words. Now I would like to invite Mr. Owen McIntyre. He is professor at the School of Law, University College in Cork, Ireland, where he is as well director of the Environmental and Natural Resources Law Program and co-director of the Center of Law and Environment. Professor McIntyre's principal interest is the field of environmental law with a particular focus on international law. He's as well a consultant on transboundary water cooperation for several international financial institutions and organizations. Owen, you can take the micro.
Thank you, Maria. Do I share my screen, Maria, or does someone at your end do that?
Yes, as you wish, Owen. If you want, I can do for you.
Perhaps you should. My internet is a little unstable here, Mara, so if you wouldn't mind, thank you. Thank you, Mara. I want to just talk about multilateral environmental agreements and the very closely related customary principles of international environmental law, and the extent to which these instruments and broader principles are relevant to the development, the construction, the operation of dams. And they are highly relevant. But I think international law, perhaps we could go to the next slide, Mara, please. I think that international environmental law, generally conventional and customary, is relevant in two key ways. First of all, in terms of biodiversity conservation. And dams, of course, have potentially a very significant impact on biodiversity. So we have a range of instruments and emerging principles of biodiversity conservation which are directly relevant. But also, I think the second category of multilateral environmental agreements, particularly agreements at this stage and emerging custom, are the horizontal environmental requirements. So I suppose they're mainly procedural and aimed at providing a structure for the sharing of relevant information. The third thing I want to look at is how these norms come to be applied to a range of actors in the development and operation of hydropower facilities and how compliance is ensured. So perhaps, Mara, we could jump. So first of all, to talk about biodiversity, and Diego did list a range of these instruments. So we have quite a broad range of instruments which protect different aspects of biodiversity. We have, of course, the Convention on Biological Diversity. We have Ramsar, the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands. We have the Bonn Convention on Migratory Species. We have the Berne Convention on European Wildlife and Habitats. We have the World Heritage Convention, etc., etc. So a range of instruments developed over a period of decades, but that each focus on rather different aspects, really. So some focusing on ecosystems more generally, Ramsar on wetlands, the Bonn Convention on species, the Heritage Convention on natural heritage. But again, they create quite a dense fabric, if you like, of biodiversity obligations. The normative requirements, when we look at these conventions, the normative requirements initially appear quite modest. Requirements regarding interstate cooperation, the designation of protected areas, possibly requirements for notification. either directly or indirectly requirements for EIA or assessment of activities or projects, and requirements around monitoring, data sharing, awareness raising, etc. But of course, and Alistair, alluded to this in the context of international water law, that these conventions have undergone significant ongoing elaboration. If we think about the CBD and Ramsar, for example, they have been law machines, normative generators. And the CBD, which has given us the ecosystem approach, the wise use of wetlands, the entire concept of the wise use of wetlands under Ramsar, developed by the Scientific and Technical Review Panel into a major body of work. Several of these conventions, under the conventions, guidance has been developed on maintaining environmental flows, maintaining ecosystem services, identifying, quantifying, and maintaining ecosystem services, and payment for ecosystem services. So they have been elaborated quite significantly. And many of these more detailed frameworks are directly relevant to dams. Of course, there are customary principles. If we think of the no harm principle, which has of course been mentioned as a key principle of international water law, it's a key principle of international environmental law. We find it in the vast majority of MEAs in one form or another. Ecosystems maintenance and ecosystem services protection or maintenance, the protection of species, and all of which are wrapped up in customary secondary rules, for example, state responsibility. And if we look at the relatively recent, the decision of the International Court of Justice in the certain activities case, Costa Rica and Nicaragua, we see all of these concepts wrapped up, if you like, in that decision. Can we move on, Mara, please? The horizontal environmental requirements are really around project governance in dam construction and are relevant to dam construction and operation. And we have a list of conventions here. ESPO has been mentioned already. On EIA, which of course specifically mentions dams, includes dams in the relevant annex. The Kiev Protocol on Strategic Environmental Assessment, and the Aarhus Convention, I think, really, really important here, and of course the Escazú Agreement on the participatory rights, on access to environmental information for public and stakeholders, on rights of participation in decision-making processes, and of course on access to justice. And then, of course, we have a number of customary principles. EIA itself is a customary principle, we could say, since the Pulp Mills case in 2010. And participatory rights, although they're much more directly applicable under a conventional framework like Aarhus, they go right back to real principle time. Sorry, Mara, may we jump? Thank you. And then I think what's really interesting about the body of international environmental law is its application and its compliance. So in terms of application, we do of course have host state duties under most of these instruments, but as we know, all of us, that the existence of host state duties doesn't necessarily mean that we will have effective implementation or compliance in all cases. So what we also have here, and which is hugely relevant to the hydropower sector, is that we have, for example, a whole range and a number of people have alluded to them, a whole range of normativity of different types of standards and rules and procedures that we might characterize as transnational environmental law. I think a very important example here are the Multilateral Development Bank and International Financial Institutions environmental and social safeguard policies. Very many of these either have regard to or expressly incorporate within the safeguards MEA standards and MEA requirements. And so they really have, here we have a mechanism whereby these become directly relevant to private sector investors, of course, to states also, but to the financial institutions supporting and financing many of these projects. And then along with that comes compliance. So many of the both biodiversity instruments and the horizontal environmental instruments do have compliance mechanisms, either formal or informal. Examples include the Bonn review mechanism dating from 2017, the Bern monitoring mechanism, the case file system, that goes back to 1984. Even then, less formal compliance mechanisms such as under Ramsar COP. If we take the example of the Bistro Canal controversy, which was raised at both the 9th and 10th Ramsar COPs in 2005 and 2008. Of course, the Aarhus Convention Compliance Committee, I think, needs no introduction as regards a mechanism for ensuring compliance with horizontal governance requirements. And of course, all multilateral development banks and IFIs and many other international institutions and organizations that support such projects have independent accountability mechanisms, or IAMs. You know, if you think of the World Bank Inspection Panel, the IFC, CAO, the Compliance Audit and Ombudsman function. And for example, the IFC CAO keep data on the types of complaints that they see. And an increasing number are to do with water. And water is one of the fundamental issues in the complaint. Now, that's connected not just to hydropower and renewable energy, also to things like the growth in projects in the agri-food sector. In my own experience, I worked with I was a member of the project complaints mechanism of EBRD for many years. And we saw a big number of complaints to do with dams. So they're very live on the civil society radar, if you like, for using these complaint mechanisms. And more broadly, the transnational environmental law sphere has a big role to play. The hydropower sustainability assessment protocol has already been mentioned, and a range of, Mara went through a range of these other types of new kind of normative arrangements, which are directly relevant to those involved in the construction and operation of dams. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Owen. It's a pity that we were losing your voice sometimes, but with the slides, I hope it was clear for everyone. Now I would like to invite Mrs. Angelica Bonifanti, who is Associate Professor at the University of Milano. Her teaching and research focus mainly on business and human rights, public and private international law, civil law, and international trade and investment law. Angelica is the author of the book Imprese multinazionali, diritti umani e ambiente. Angelica, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Maria. Thanks to the organizers for this invitation. I have prepared a PowerPoint that I would like to share. Just let's find it. Okay. Is it fine? Yes? Can you hear me properly? Okay. So thank you very much. So as Maria and the distinguished speakers who have introduced the panel have already told, my presentation will be focused on the relationship existing between the construction of dams, the respect of human rights, and the role of corporations. So my reflections will be specifically devoted to the role of business operators and to their accountability to respect human rights within the implementation of hydropower projects and the construction of dams. So there is no need probably to remind that hydropower projects and the construction of dams face considerable risks on human rights, including the negative potential and including the negative potential and effective impacts on the right to water and sanitation and other connected rights, going from the right to food, the right to life, the right to health, the right to house, to adequate standard of living, and the free and prior and informed consent and the right not to be forced displaced of local and indigenous communities. Now, several cases of impacts on the enjoyment of human rights due to the construction of dams has been reported. For instance, the Special Rapporteur on the right to water in 2019 submitted a report where several cases were referred. The Lesotho Island Water Project, or the Nihuil hydroelectric dam in Argentina, the El Cercado Dam in Colombia, were all mentioned for their impacts on the enjoyment of the right to water. And so the special rapporteur emphasized the need that the human rights impact assessment prioritize the role of water for domestic and sanitation use. Other impacts on human rights, again, were stressed by several non-governmental organization reports. For instance, some NGOs expressed concern about the construction of the lower Season 2 in Cambodia. And again, about the construction of, the construction of the Suapiti hydroelectric dam in Guinea, all built by Chinese state-owned companies. Or again, other concerns on the respect on the consistency with the international human rights standards were raised by the Santa Rita Dam in Guatemala, who were referred to the Rogun Dam or to the Iliso project. So, and these are examples, obviously. I mean, these are just some of the examples taken from the NGO reports. Concerns obviously arise also from when incidents occur. So here we can mention the collapse of the Iucn Hoi Dam in Laos, or the Brumadinho Dam disaster in Brazil as examples of human rights implications from dams collapse. Now, as I premised, so the relationship existing between the construction of dam and the enjoyment of human rights is manifest and already well reported. Now, my presentation will, as I said at the beginning, will focus on the responsibility, the accountability of corporations, and the involvement of private operators in projects likely to impact the enjoyment of human rights has already been reported, and several cases of corporate accountability for human rights can be referred. Now, what's the role of corporation and what should corporations do? Now, corporations must comply with human rights in the development of their activities. So I think there is no need to remind that corporations must respect human rights. Nonetheless, several reports show that many corporations, that just a few percentage of corporations active in the hydropower project have in place a specific commitment to respect human rights. And according to the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, moreover, the renewable energy sector is the sector where the third most frequent allegations of attacks and intimidation on human rights defenders worldwide. So the relationship existing between corporations, human rights, and the construction of dams is a very very crucial one. Now, what is happening at the international law level? As already referred my previous colleagues, international law is currently evolving on this specific issue. Since the introduction of the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights in 2011, the principle of the corporate responsibility to respect human rights was expressed at the international law level. The guiding principles, however, are a non-binding instrument. But since 2011, several developments have occurred in the direction of hardening such a principle. Several states have adopted domestic legislation on this issue, and the basic principles explained, included within the UNGPs, the United Nations Guiding Principles, are now at the center of the negotiation process at the United Nations for a binding treaty on the regulation of activities of corporations in human rights law. The main instrument that all these legislative legislations require is implementation of the so-called human rights due diligence process. So the human rights due diligence process requires companies, so also companies working in the hydropower project and in the construction of dams, to map the risks they pose on the respect of human rights, so effective and potential risks, to prevent the abuses and to remediate them in case they occur. So the introduction of these principles will necessarily affect also the development of hydropower projects. Maria, do I have 2 minutes still? Yes, okay. So I would like just to make an interesting, from my opinion, examples taken from the praxis of the Italian National Contact Point for the OECD guidelines, another soft law instrument mentioned by Mara. Before the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises are a soft law instrument adopted in 1976 and reviewed in 2011, including standards on human rights compliance by corporations, standards of conduct that corporations should respect. All the adhering countries to the OECD guidelines have in place a national contact point, the mandate of which is to monitor the application of the guidelines by the corporations. The Italian national contact point has recently settled the case concerning the alleged lack of compliance by Salini Tregilo, an Italian building company, with the human rights chapter of the OECD guidelines within the construction of the Gibefer Dam. And the allegation consisted in the fact that according to the compliance, Survival International, a non-governmental organization, the company had not obtained the free, prior and informed consent by the local communities. The national contact point recommended the company to do all its best effort to consult the downstream communities, and I quote, to this aim, Salini can use its leverage to monitor the status of downstream communities and foster the implementation and mitigation measures in a manner consistent with the guidelines, the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises and the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So from my perspective, this is an interesting case, and it shows that these soft law instruments have been progressively integrated within the development of practice before non-judiciary bodies, explicitly referring to the accountability of corporations in this sector for the respect of human rights. Just a few words finally on the good practice developed recently by another corporation, Électricité de France, that recently suspended its hydropower projects in Myanmar, explicitly declaring that this suspension was due to human rights concerns as the military junta took over the country in a coup at the start of February 2021, as everybody knows. So the relationship existing between dams, corporations and human rights needs to be taken into consideration, and international law is consistently developing. Thanks.
Thanks a lot to all the speakers for all the views and the lists of tools that are available. We have received a number of questions in the chat box, and we will start now the Q&A session. Because of time constraints, try to be as short as possible, and the people who are listening, do not hesitate in raising your hand. If something remains unanswered, we will follow up with you per email. So first, maybe I would like to ask Diego, one of the questions that they were submitted. It's like how local indigenous communities' voices are heard or involved in global legal frameworks.
Thanks, Maria, for this question. As Alejandro also mentioned at the beginning of this session, during the World Conservation Congress, this was a concern. Several indigenous communities said, well, there is not an adequate participation of indigenous people, civil society, local communities in decision making or planning on large water infrastructure being dams. One quick consideration would be that these principles, these global instruments that we provided could be adopted at the national level, could be considered when drafting, negotiating bilateral agreements, and they can, of course, put as a key pillar of these agreements, these policies, of these laws, involvement of indigenous peoples, not only because of a formality, but also because they are the ones who are directly impacted perhaps by these developments. That would be a fast response. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I hope the question was answered. I would like to ask now maybe Alistair or Owen, the next one. India and China have not yet ratified the Iucn water course, and the region has most number of dams and more coming up. The question is how these countries can be legally pressurized to align with the global frameworks.
Shall I go first? Thanks. I mean, I guess the short answer is they can. I mean, they're states, and they join global multilateral conventions because they see benefits in doing that. So I guess the question should be rather, what are the incentives? What are the benefits in joining these global frameworks? And I think there are huge benefits, as I'm sure the parties would attest. I think under the 92 convention in particular, we see, we're at the 9th session of the meeting of the parties this week, and see huge momentum around the convention, the activities, developing supplementary instruments, supporting its implementation. We see Remy put in the chat there the example of the implementation committee supporting countries around some of these issues and dams. And I think, and I always feel, and maybe we can articulate this better, but I always feel that, when it comes to the development of the dams, we need to make a stronger business case for why these procedures and policies are good for both those planning and those potentially affected by the projects. And I think, there are examples of projects that have gone ahead, perhaps not followed clearly some of the international law that applies, then had to be readjusted at huge costs, doing that kind of retrospectively. So I think the clearer we can be for and articulate the benefits for all concerned of having clear, coherent, predictable rules in place, is the way to incentivize signing up to these instruments.
Great, thank you. I don't know if Owen, do you want to add something to this question?
Very briefly, Maria, if I may. I think it's quite interesting that the question concerned powerful countries, like China, for example, that is very, very engaged in hydropower development. It's interesting sometimes that states can be induced to cooperate in respect of the environment or in respect of wetlands where they might not be so quick to cooperate to enter into agreements in respect of transboundary waters. Transboundary waters would always be seen as being of key strategic significance, very, very sensitive nationally in terms of future options for economic development, etc. Whereas environmental commitments and frameworks, conventional and otherwise, are often a little easier for states to engage. And if we take the example, for example, the Lake in 1996, the Lake Kangha or Lake Jinkai in China. Between China and Russia, shared between China and Russia, they entered into an agreement in 1996, even though they didn't conclude a transboundary waters agreement until 2008. And so they had, commenced cooperation for the protection of wetlands on the Soncha and Amur basins. So, often there are other ways to kind of develop that cooperation beyond the more tense environment of international water cooperation. The environmental route can be more effective, just as an observation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Owen. So now the next one, I think that would be for Mara. And Mohsen was asking us, he was wondering if we do need a single global instrument for dams, why dams are selected, in addition to the many other guidelines that we mentioned today. Might it not be better to make already a principle more clear and explicit to avoid adding other legal packages?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think that no, our idea it is not to develop another instrument or a single instrument on dams. The idea is really not to clarify what are the principles applicable to this to large dams. So we in this first phase of the project, we are focusing in particular on large dams, but then in the next phases we would like also to consider other typologies of water infrastructure. So no, the idea is really not to show how it is the different principles, rules, and frameworks are scattered in various areas of international law. So we agree that we do not need another instrument for this particular issue. Maybe Diego want to add something.
Many thanks, Mara. Exactly, the purpose of this initiative, this review, has been to analyze, to see what is already there. And as our panelists have already mentioned, there are several instruments looking at the environmental side, the human rights side, and we need this convergence between all of these instruments that can be applied in specific cases at the basin level, in bilateral negotiations. So I would agree with what Mara said. We don't want to have a specific global agreement looking at dams, but rather see what is already available there, strengthen national legislation, strengthen regional and basin agreements, and consider the principles that we have just mentioned now. There is a wide variety of tools out there. It's a matter of implement them.
Thanks. I don't know if Angelica, do you want to give us your perspective on this question?
Thanks, Maria. Yes, coming to the human rights side, as already said, yes, there are implications, and the already existing international law instruments clearly provide for the responsibility of state to protect from the human rights violations, also at the level of inter-private violations, so put in place by corporations. clearly the development of specific instruments of the responsibility of corporations is hopeful, let's say. So in this field, we don't need necessarily something specific on dams, but we need something specific on corporations, maybe. So the instruments the tools I was mentioning before, the provision for the implementation of a human rights due diligence would be welcome once established as a mandatory procedures that corporations should respect, and would be very useful also in this specific sector where human rights impacts can be many and complex and long-term issues. The United Nations, in just if I may, what is happening at the United Nations level with the negotiation of the binding treaty on the activities of corporations in human rights law. So the United Nations are negotiating a treaty. The negotiations started in 2014 and they are revising the third draft. In this moment, it provides for the introduction of duties on corporations by the contracting parties, also on state-owned corporations, which is something interesting in this field where the role of state corporations, of state-owned corporations is a strong one, let's say. So, I mean, I think that the introduction of binding standards would be welcome instead in this field. Thanks.
That's great. Thanks a lot for your answers. Actually, Remy Kina was posting a link to a recent practical example for the first advisory procedure under the implementation. And I would like to ask him if he could take the microphone and give us a bit his views about the role of the implementation committee.
Hello, Maria, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, firstly, I just wanted to say thank you very much to Geneva Water Hub for organising this official side event for the meeting of the parties of the Water Convention. Thank you very much for organising it. Also great to see such great panelists and speakers, and very much thank you to all of you for participating, and also for everybody online who's participating. Firstly, I'd like to start with saying that there are a multitude of resources that we have to answer some of these questions as well. And I would refer people to, there's a policy brief on the two global conventions, which talks about how they interact and how they can be interpreted together. We have a frequently asked questions document under the Water Convention, which addresses also some of these issues. And we're also about to adopt a handbook on water allocation in a transboundary context at the meeting of the parties this week. And that document is not binding, but it does provide guidance and key elements and main messages which relate to flow regulation. And that includes dams and interbasin transfers and other infrastructure projects that are relevant to flow regulation. I wanted to highlight the example of the first advisory procedure under the implementation committee, purely because it's an example of countries coming together at the request of Montenegro about concerns they had about the possible transboundary impact of planned small hydropower plants on a transboundary river in Albania. And Albania accepted to participate in that advisory procedure. And the implementation committee is quite unique in this way, in that it's set up as a non-adversarial dispute prevention and resolution mechanism, and it's brought Albania and Montenegro together to establish a joint technical working group on monitoring and assessment to develop and implement an information exchange protocol to operationalize their cooperation on this shared river in relation to their obligations in regards to these hydropower plants and the concerns and issues that they had. So I feel like this is a very unique example that needs to be highlighted, because it's directly in relation to hydropower plants on a transboundary river, which is very pertinent for this conversation. And I also wanted to highlight the fact that, I mean, a lot of the speakers have highlighted this, is that this is a multi-layered issue. And, it generally starts at the national level, and with, national laws and strengthening those national laws, particularly around environmental impact assessment and project-related laws. Then you're looking at transboundary cooperation and what kind of joint mechanisms and joint institutions are in place. And some of these joint bodies on shared rivers have developed procedures for regulating the development of planned measures, such as In the case of the Mekong River Commission, they have the PNPCA, which relates to prior notification, consultation and agreement in regards to planned measures such as dams. And then you work your way up to the global instruments. And the global instruments are framework instruments. They provide the foundational elements, but it's really, as Diego was saying, the implementation all the way down to national scale of these obligations and also the details that come with such things as the Ruggie Principles and the OECD guidelines that add flavour to some of these obligations. So I just want to say there's a multitude of resources, happy to share those with those participants online. And once again, thank you to everybody who's participated in Geneva Water Hub for organising this. And everybody's welcome at the MOP this coming week. And please register if you haven't already. Thank you.
Thanks, Remy. So we are approaching now the end of the session. I would like again to invite Alejandro Iucn and Christian Breteau for the closing remarks. There's a question from Otham that will be answered per email because of time constraints. And I think all the participants will be receiving the presentations by emails. So please, Alejandro.
I think that perhaps we have lost Alejandro. So on behalf of him,
no, you do not lose me,
sorry.
Diego. No, not that easy. You cannot get rid of myself that easy. Friends and colleagues, thank you. I think we had, I was silently listening to the discussions and all the interventions, very rich ones in the course of this session. Still, we have a lot of things to do. I just wanted to say thanks to all the participants and especially, those that kindly agree to participate in this very first, event of this important week for the Water Convention. We are very much looking forward to the next steps of this initiative. So we have discussed already, or you have heard already from Mara, from Diego, from the other colleagues, what is the work ahead. And from the side of IUCN, just to thank you all, and also to thank our hosts of this meeting and our partners, the Geneva Water Hub. I look forward, to the next stage of this fascinating project together.
Well, thank you, Alejandro. Thank you. Well, a few concluding words from my side as well. Thank you first, UNEC Water Convention, for this opportunity to organize this side event. Many thanks to you all participants, to the panelists that joined us today. Thank you also to Maria for the moderation of this event. And finally, thank you for all the input and questions we received so far. I mean, we already could gather some input in order to further develop our initiative. And I'm sure that additional resources will be included in the work. I mean, it has been mentioned by all the panelists. International water law plays a fundamental role, and we believe that there is a need to bring clarity to what exists, actually, to the existing instruments, but also to focus on the challenges related to the implementation of those different instruments. So in the upcoming month, in terms of direction we aim to take, first, we certainly wish to further refine our compendium based on all the different useful remarks we received today. And again, I invite you all to take a look to the document and to get in touch if you see anything to be added to the work. That would be very much useful. And also we aim to broaden up the perspective, to governance and empirical analysis to understand challenges and opportunities also related to these different bodies of law, and challenges related to, obviously, to implementation of those different bodies of law. Finally, I'd like to again underline the fact that this initiative is very open. So I invite you all to get in touch if you want to get involved in any way, and we look forward to see the work being further developed in upcoming months. Thank you all.
Great. I would like to join again the conversation to thank all the panelists and the organizers. We are finishing on time, and thanks to everyone who has been listening today. Don't forget to follow this project and enjoy the rest of the events of the UNSC Water Week. Thanks.